I am very happy to introduce Jon Anderson. He is our senior systems consultant here at Now Micro, and he will be leading us through the presentation today. So thank you again for joining us, and then passing it over to you, Jon.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Jordan. So hello, everyone. As Jordan mentioned, today we're going to be talking about device management with Intune and Autopilot. So the agenda for today, pretty straightforward. Just going to go through quick introductions, do kind of an overview of the current Autopilot process, how that works to deploy devices, how that kind of integrates with Intune, how you can use that to modernize your device management. And then we'll also talk about the future of Autopilot. So Microsoft has recently kind of put out an Autopilot V2 or a new way to do Autopilot. So we'll dig into that a little bit as well. And then there'll be many demos throughout. And like Jordan said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type in the chat and we can get them answered as we go along. And I'll try to also leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. So as I mentioned, I'm Jon Anderson. I'm a senior systems consultant here at Now Micro. I've been doing the consulting thing for over 14 years now, actually. Started off with Configuration Manager 2007, 2012. These days, it's a lot of the cloud stuff with Intune and Autopilot. Yeah, I've got my email down at the bottom there too. So again, if there's questions that don't get answered, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I also mentioned I work for Now Micro. We're based out of the Twin Cities, and we've been around for over 30 years now. I like to describe us as a device lifecycle company, so we can help out with kind of all the stages of your devices, from initially buying them and getting them deployed and imaged, to getting them delivered and the ongoing management of those devices, all the way up to retiring and recycling the devices. In addition to that, we've also got a pretty strong IoT side of the business with digital signage type devices, and a services department, which I'm a member of, so we can help you out with various professional services you might need. Last piece of marketing here, we've also got our DICE tool, which at its core is like an asset management tool and an order tracking tool. But it also has some extra optional features like real-time device management, real-time insights on devices, geolocation, management of vPro, those types of things. So again, any interest in that, don't hesitate to reach out. All right, so the meat of today's presentation, we're talking about deploying Windows devices. So in traditional Windows deployment, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, you buy new devices and you have some sort of management tool like a configuration manager where you've built an image and apps and driver packages and all sorts of things, right? So you get those new pieces of hardware and you wipe out what's on them from the manufacturer and instead load down all of the custom things you've built. This has been effective, but it's starting to kind of show some cracks in the modern world with how devices are managed and how workforces are remote now. So what Microsoft has been pivoting to is the modern Windows deployment. So with modern deployment, we're not looking at wiping out that device that you're buying from the vendor. Instead, we want to just take that operating system that's preloaded and customize it for our needs. And this makes it much easier to get devices out to people who are remote and have them be actively managed and even redeployed or repurposed as needed. So just kind of a quick little overview of what the current Autopilot deployment looks like. So you, as the administrator of your environment, sign into the Microsoft Intune portal, and you configure an Autopilot deployment profile. You configure settings, applications, all that kind of stuff. And then you order devices from, say, Now Micro. Now Micro gets those devices in and harvests the device information that's unique to each device and uploads that to the Windows Autopilot database. The Windows Autopilot database then synchronizes with your Intune tenant and gets the profile that you've built and gets the apps and policies and everything all assigned to it via group memberships. so that when those devices are shipped out, either to you at a central location or maybe even directly to the end user, when that device first boots up, it is able to get all of those apps and settings and everything that you've targeted at it. So for a real world look at what that looks like, I've got a video here that I recorded on a virtual machine with just a fresh Windows installation. So this would simulate booting up a device that you've ordered from the manufacturer fresh out of the box for the first time. So I've sped this up here for ease of watching purposes, but it boots up into the out-of-box experience and then comes, oops, pause that, not skip ahead. Let's go back to here. So it boots up to the out-of-box experience and then comes to the sign-on screen. So every Windows device, the out-of-box experience has a built-in check behind the scenes that checks to see if the device has been registered with Autopilot. And if it has, it bypasses the normal out-of-box experience and goes into this Autopilot experience. And you can see it's got my branded Contoso demo organization. This would be your own organization, and it wants you to sign in with your work account. So I go ahead and sign in here. And then now the device is in the autopilot provisioning process. So it's going to go out and check with Intune and apply, join my device to the organization, join it to Entra ID, maybe even join it to a local Active Directory if that's configured. It'll install apps, apply security policies, certificates, Wi-Fi profiles, encrypt the drive with BitLocker, all the different things that we might have set up. So you can see on the status screen here, we're seeing like security policies applied. It's installing apps down here, 2 of 4. Again, I've sped this up, but the real-time runtime of this process took about 15 minutes, so really not too bad. So after the device phase of Autopilot's done, we can then sign into the device with our user account. And then we have the user phase of Autopilot. So Autopilot is kind of split into 2 different phases. There's the device phase where everything that's targeted at the device object happens, and then there's the user phase where everything targeted at the user object happens. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more as we go through things. So actually, I want to back out of the presentation here and jump over to Intune. So how do we make that Autopilot process a reality in your environment? So the first step is we need to go to intune.microsoft.com and then go to Devices and Enrollment. And then down at the bottom here under Windows Autopilot, you have this Devices node. So in order for a device to go through this traditional Autopilot deployment, the device needs to be registered in this list, and it'll be identified by its serial number, manufacturer, and model. So there's a few ways to get devices into this list. The easiest way is when you're ordering new devices from a Microsoft partner, Dell, HP, Lenovo, or from now Micro even. We can use that partner connection to harvest the information off the devices as they sit in our warehouse and then upload them to Autopilot on your behalf. You could also get a CSV file from us with that information, or you could even one-off register devices, which I actually do have a demo of here. So if we go next, device registration demo. So this is, again, a device that's booted up like fresh out of the box, but hasn't already been registered with Autopilot. So when you're at this out-of-box screen, you can press Shift F10 on the keyboard and you'll get a command prompt. And then if we type PowerShell to get into PowerShell, we set the execution policy so we can run a script, and then we say install script get-Windows Autopilot info. So this is a script written by Microsoft, just available on the PowerShell gallery. Once that's installed, we go ahead and run the script with the -online parameter. This will install a few modules. It'll pop up a box asking me to authenticate with my credentials so that it knows which tenant to upload the device information to. And there we go. It gathers the details and uploads it. Again, I sped this up. You can see it took about 1.5 minutes to complete. So not too bad. And really what that's doing is just grabbing some device information behind the scenes. So if we look at another device here, we can see that that data really just comes out of WMI. So we can get the hardware hash with a WMI command. We can get the serial number with a WMI command. And then you could put that information manually into like a CSV file and upload it. The last thing I wanted to note is that if you do have an existing tool like a configuration manager, you can use a query in configuration manager to pull that information as well. So if you just look at the device information hardware hash and PC BIOS serial number, that'll collect you all the information you need. You can then put that in a CSV file and upload it. Okay, so back over in Autopilot here, we've got our devices now in the list. Let's see, 1 second here. I just need to go back to my notes over here. Okay, so we've got the devices in the list. So the next thing we need is an Autopilot deployment profile to be assigned to them. So if we go back to our list here, we've got our Autopilot deployment profiles. And we'll just take a second for that to load. There we go. So you can create multiple different types of profiles in here, a user-driven profile or a self-deploying profile. So user-driven is intended for like one-to-one devices where you've got one user that's going to be using one device primarily. And then self-deploying is more for shared type devices. So kiosks, public area computers, meeting room computers, that type of thing. When you're going through the profiles, you can see you've got several options that you can select. So we can select if it's user-driven or self-deploying. We can decide if the device is going to be joined just to Entra or if it's going to be hybrid joined, where it's also joined to a local Active Directory domain. Show or hide the license terms, privacy settings, set if the user is going to be a standard or administrator account. We can even apply like a device name template here. The one thing I do want to note, though, is there's this allow pre-provision deployment option. So when we were running through the Autopilot demo earlier, I did speed it up, but it still took 15 minutes, which isn't too bad. Though not everyone is happy with that. Like if you give a user a new device, you don't necessarily want to have to wait 15-20 minutes before the user can sign into their device. So that's where the idea of this pre-provision deployment comes into play. So pre-provision deployment is a mode we can put the device in where it will run and apply all of the device specific settings to the device, and then we can shut it back down before handing it to the user. So then I've actually got a quick demo of that here as well. So on a device, when you're at this sign-on screen, you can press the Windows key 5 times and it'll bypass the sign-on screen and put it into a pre-provisioning mode. From here, we can select the pre-provision with Windows Autopilot option. And then we get to this screen where we're ready to pre-provision. So we can go ahead and click next here. We can see it's picked up our organization, our deployment profile and everything. And then the device will start applying all of the device specific settings. And then at the end, we can shut the device back down. And now it's ready to be handed to the user, but most of the apps are already installed and it'll greatly reduce the amount of time they need to wait before actually using the system. So pre-provisioning is something you could do yourself. It's something we commonly do at Now Micro for a lot of our clients. They'll order, 100 devices, and we put those devices on our bench in our production area, get them all pre-provisioned before sending them out to the client. So it's kind of like the modern version of imaging a little bit. All right, so that's the deployment profiles. So those are created, but how do you actually target them at devices? So that's where groups come into play. So over in the groups list here, we want to go to Intune Autopilot All Devices. So this is a group I've made with a dynamic membership rule that right here will include all Autopilot devices. So this is just a rule created by Microsoft and includes all of those Autopilot device records. And then we could target an Autopilot deployment profile at that group, and it would just apply to all devices. But maybe we want to have multiple deployment profiles, like a kiosk profile and a user-driven profile. So let's see. If we want to do the kiosk profile, we can have our self-deploying profile that's targeted at the kiosk profile, but we don't want to have duplicates, right? We can't have a user-driven profile and a self-deploying profile both targeted at the same thing. So how do we split those out? So what you can do is create a separate group here. So I've created one called like Intune Autopilot Kiosk. And then I've got a dynamic membership rule where it says if the order ID is equal to kiosk. So what that is really, it's called order ID here, but it's the group tag. So if we go back to our Autopilot devices list, you can see on each device, you can specify a group tag. So if I put kiosk, for example, in the group tag here and save it, then this device will automatically go into that group that has the kiosk query tied to it. And then I could have my kiosk profiles, my self-deploying profile, everything all targeted at that group. So using the group tags is a nice way to automatically sort the devices into groups and have them, go where you want and have what you want targeted at them. I will also note on the device here, you can type in a device name, and that will override the default name in the template. So if you want to do a more detailed device name, you can specify that here. So then the only other things really needed to get Autopilot working is this automatic enrollment section here. You need to have your MDM user scope set to either all or some, and then some would just be a group that contains the users you want to do Autopilot. In addition to that, you need to have a couple of DNS records set up so you can use this CNAME validation to make sure that that is correctly configured. So just put in your domain and click test, and it should come back with a green check mark. If it doesn't, you can click on this learn more link to find out what records to create. And then lastly, there's the enrollment status page. So this just controls how the enrollment looks to the end user. So you can set like a timeout. You can choose to show status to the end user, allow users to like use the device even if an installation error occurs. So this is kind of the look and feel of Autopilot. So that's what's needed just at a base level to make Autopilot work. And then the other thing I want to show real quick as a demo is kind of how to troubleshoot Autopilot if an issue happens. So I've got a video here where we've got a device that's running through Autopilot. And then at any point during this Autopilot, you can press Control-Shift-D on the keyboard, and it'll open the diagnostics page. And you can see all sorts of just different diagnostic information about where the device is at during Autopilot and what it might have an issue with or an error on. Do note that while this page is open, the Autopilot process is paused. So you'd want to go back out of this once you're done looking at whatever. There is also an export logs button here that'll collect all the relevant log files on the device. If that doesn't have the level of detail that you need, though, there is also a PowerShell script you can run. So much like the other PowerShell script we ran, Shift F10 to get a command prompt. And then we're going to do install script again, but this time it's get-autopilot diagnostics. Again, another Microsoft script that can run and tell you information about the autopilot process. So if we show running that script here, we can see it gathers a bunch of information about the deployment, and we can kind of see the processes it goes through, and then importantly down at the bottom here, the different steps. So if it fails on an app, it'll generally show you right down at the bottom here which app it failed on. Okay, and then the last thing is in Intune here, there is a report for Windows Autopilot deployment status that'll show you kind of a history of the different Autopilot deployments happening in your environment. It'll generally show you if it was successful or failed, but it doesn't really give you a whole lot of information about beyond that, just kind of some general high level information and how long the deployment took and everything. Okay, so we've got the base autopilot working. So that'll let us deploy a machine with just basic settings, but really no customizations. So the next thing is, how do we actually get apps and security policies and all that kind of stuff to apply? So in that case, let's start with apps. If we go to apps, Windows, we can add an app here, and there's kind of two main types that we'll end up using a lot of. There's the Store app new and the Windows app Win32. So let's start with the Win32 app, since that's what most people are going to be familiar with. This is your traditional EXE, MSI, script-based installer, like maybe a batch file, PowerShell script, that type of thing. So if we select that, the first thing it's looking for is a .intune win file. So how do we get that? So over here, I've got a folder where I've got VLC Media Player. I've got my MSI installer. I've got my install and uninstall batch files, my customization scripts, that type of thing. So what you have to do is you can't just upload these individual files. You have to zip them up into that .intune win file. And Microsoft has this Intune win app util exe for that purpose. So if you run this, it'll ask for what is the source folder. So we can just copy this folder path. What is the setup file? So that's our install vlc.bat. And then what's the output folder? So I have a cdemo apps output. And then we'll say no at the catalog folder, since that's something for an old version of Windows that we don't need anymore. And now in the output folder, we've got our install vlc.intune win file. So now in this browse window here, I can go into apps, output, and select that Intune win file, and it uploads it. I can then specify information about the app. Maybe give it a nice logo if I want it to look nice in the company portal. Specify the install command and the uninstall command. So I'd specify the install batch file, the uninstall batch file. I can choose if I want to install for system or user, custom return codes. Specify some basic requirements, 32 or 64-bit. Maybe you need a specific version of the OS. You can run a script to check for any other specific customizations you might need. Detection rules, you can do much like with Configuration Manager, detect on like a registry, MSI, or file code. Or you can use a custom detection script. So in this case, I've got a detection script I put together. So I'm just going to browse for that. You can set up dependency chains. So if you have other apps that need to install before this app, you can select that here. You can also supersede an app. So if you're building a new version that replaces an old version, supersedence works great for that. And then finally, you can assign the app out. So you have the option to assign it to a group as required, or make it available to a group of users as available if you want them to be able to install it through the company portal. And you can also deploy out the uninstall, assuming that you've specified an actual uninstall script for the app. And then create. So that process will look very similar to many of you that are familiar with packaging apps through Configuration Manager. It's the same kind of process where you got to get your silent install figured out and everything, and then the detection method and click through all the steps. There's just the extra step of having to use the Intune content prep tool to zip up the files ahead of time. So the other most common type of app you'll build in here is the Microsoft Store app new. If we select that app here, then we get a link to say search the Microsoft Store for an app. So in here, I could just say search for VLC, and then we see there's two different options, and one of them is the Win32 version of VLC. So I can just select that. It automatically fills out the information, go next, and then I'm already at the assignment screen again for required and available and uninstall. So much easier to build the app as a Windows Store app. And the nice benefit with this is that the content is always up to date because it's just installing it from the store. We don't have to worry about maintaining that content through like a Win32 app. And what this Microsoft Store app new is doing is it's really just kind of like a front end for the Windows Package Manager, or WinGet. If you're not familiar with that, it's a tool that's built into all the new versions of Windows now. So you can just type from your PowerShell or command prompt, WinGet, search, and then what do I want to search for? So VLC, for instance. And then we get a results of a bunch of VLC packages. So then I could also do like winget install VLC and install it, right? But the nice thing with Intune is it provides that front end for that, so I don't have to go run those commands. So that's kind of apps, the two main types of apps that we'd work with. Next thing I want to show is how do we get settings to devices. So devices, Windows, configuration profiles is where we're going to do most of the work. So that you can think of this as kind of like your cloud group policy. Most of the settings that you would normally be used to seeing in group policy can be found here. So if you do create new policy, there's two options here, templates and settings catalog. You're mostly going to be wanting to use settings catalog. Give it just a temporary name here. And then we have the option to add settings. And then you just get your whole big list of settings that you're used to seeing. So for instance, like administrative templates and Windows components, and you see all the different settings and parts of the operating system that you're used to seeing being able to configure. Maybe I want to set up a policy here that controls Microsoft Office update settings. I can go down to my Microsoft Office settings here, updates, and then when I click on a category, I see all the settings within that category, and I can choose which ones I want to add to my policy. So maybe I want to say enable automatic updates and set the update channel. So then I have the settings here. I can turn them on, configure them how I want. Maybe I forgot I need to add another setting. I can just go back into the settings catalog here and pick another setting to add to it. Or maybe I decided I didn't actually want that setting. I could just click the little minus button here to remove that from the policy again. So once I've got all the settings built the way I want, I just go next. And once again, I can assign these policies out to a group of users or devices. And then create. So very easy to build settings through the settings catalog. As I mentioned, there is also the templates in here, which you might want to use sometimes. So there's things like kiosk profiles, certificate templates, VPN or Wi-Fi profiles. And what's nice about these is they take a bunch of those settings from the settings catalog and concentrate them all in one spot for you, kind of all the settings you might need when you're doing that specific thing. So for instance, if I click on kiosk here and go next, I can select to build just a basic kiosk. I can have it automatically do auto log on for me, launch an Edge browser, go to some website, maybe have it be in full screen mode. It makes it super easy to set up a kiosk for you. The other place that you'll be doing settings is over here under endpoint security. So anything security related, Microsoft has kind of put under this node. So if you're doing Defender antivirus, BitLocker, firewall, any of the more advanced Defender features like app control policies, attack surface reduction rules, those would all be done here. Even like the new version of LAPS, anything security related is generally here. Though having said that, not everything is here. So if there's something that you just can't find in this location, devices and configuration profiles is where you go to configure it then.
And I've got a question that came in.
Yeah.
So it says configuration policies conflict due to duplication when assigned to both a user and a device simultaneously. How do you determine whether to assign a policy to a user or a device, and what criteria do you use to decide when to assign it to each?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's much like with group policy, right? So if you're applying a policy that contains a bunch of user settings, you'd probably target it at users. And if you're applying a bunch of device settings, you might end up targeting it at devices. Though it does generally work a lot better in Intune to target things at users if your devices mostly are one-to-one type devices, right? Where you have a primary user tied to them. If we have a bunch of shared devices where they don't have a primary user, it doesn't work as well to do user targeting on those devices. So it kind of depends on the policies that you're applying and the types of devices that you're applying them to. Um, but in general, yeah, user settings, you're going to want to target at users. Devices, you can target at either or, but I see people pretty commonly still just target them at devices. So the other thing I wanted to mention in here is we see how to create the policies, but what if you have years and years worth of group policy that you want to look at importing into here? So Microsoft has a tool for that in here called Group Policy Analytics. And if you come in here, you can do import and then browse for a group policy file. So if you go into your group policy management and just export a report of one of your group policies as an XML, you'll be able to then pull it into this group policy analytics tool. And what this tool does is looks at all the settings within that policy and tries to automatically map them to their matching Intune setting. We can see here it thinks that 94% of the settings in this policy have a matching Intune setting. So we can click into here and get more details about the list. We see this one is missing a setting. And that doesn't always mean it doesn't exist. Sometimes it's just not the best at matching them up. So we might just be able to go search and find that setting somewhere else. But say I want to migrate this settings policy over to Intune. I can just click the migrate button up at the top here. And then I can choose the individual settings I want to migrate, or maybe I want to just migrate all of them. Though I would say if you're migrating from group policy, I wouldn't recommend just blanket importing everything. This is a great time or a great opportunity to clean up your group policy because it probably has years worth of old things that may not be needed anymore. But I'll just select all the supported settings here and go next. And next, and then give that policy a name. Next, next. And then again, I could assign it out to groups of users or devices. And deploy. So it actually did run into an issue migrating one of the settings related to Internet Explorer, but it should have still created the policy for us. Yep, so now we see a new security baseline policy in here. And if I go edit it, we can see it made it as a settings catalog, and then we've got all the settings in here configured just the way I had them in group policy. So a great tool to kind of save you time if you're trying to migrate stuff from GPO to Intune. Okay, so that's most of the settings. And then anything that you can't do with one of the built-in settings in Configuration Manager, that's where I usually go to the scripts node. So with Intune, we can deploy PowerShell scripts out to devices that run as the local system account. So basically, we can do anything on the device, right? PowerShell as local system. And there's two kinds of scripts you can run here. So you see there's remediations and platform scripts. So platform scripts are kind of like run once scripts. And then remediations are run on a schedule scripts. So a platform script might be something I would deploy like during an autopilot deployment to devices. So for instance, I've got a script that would configure a bunch of default Windows settings or remove pre-installed vendor software that I don't want. So I've got just like a quick look at those scripts here. So you see I've got my one to remove vendor software. It searches for a bunch of like Dell, HP, Lenovo software and removes it if it's found. My customization script would go through and set a bunch of default settings for, maybe turning off Cortana or the logon animation or the Windows consumer features, that type of thing. So that's a great use case for these platform scripts. Remediations is maybe something where we want to make sure something stays in a particular configuration. So for instance, I've got one in here to remove promotional Office installations. So like a lot of times brand new devices will have a kind of a promotional version of Office installed or pre-installed. And I've seen that version maybe reappear over time through like a Windows update. So I've got in here a detection script that checks, is that version of Office existing on the machine? And then if it's found, run the remediation script to remove it. And then the nice thing is when you assign this out, Just target it at something. We can check how often do we want that to run. So do I want it to run once a day, maybe once every 7 days? Maybe I want to run it, once every hour. You can get pretty aggressive with it. So the remediations are definitely a cool feature to kind of keep things just the way you like them. And then the last major setting thing to talk about in here is Windows updates. So when we're looking at getting our devices in the cloud, we're getting away from traditional update management like on-prem WSUS servers and SCCM software updates, that type of thing. And instead, we're going to be using Windows Update for Business. So these settings here let us configure Windows Update for Business. And if we look at the settings, it's really pretty basic in here. We're just saying, we want to allow Microsoft product updates. We want to allow driver updates. So driver updates are a great thing to have through here, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And then we've got the main things I want to talk about. So deferral period and then deadline settings. So this kind of controls how the devices get the updates. So the deferral is how many days after the update's been released before the device can see it. So updates come out on patch Tuesday. If I have a deferral of 2 days, the device won't actually see that update until the Thursday after patch Tuesday. And then if I have a deadline of 1 day, that's basically an availability period. So the updates show up on Thursday, but then the device doesn't actually install them until Friday. And then the grace period is once the updates have installed, how long does the device wait to reboot? So if I also have that set to 1, then the updates may install on Friday, but the reboot isn't actually required until Saturday. So using the deferral, deadline, and grace period is how you can control when devices get those updates. And then you could have multiple rings here. So you see, I just have the one, but maybe I would have like a test group and then production A, production B, production C. And each one of those would have, a longer deferral period before they install so that you can kind of stage the rollout of updates to your environment. And then if there is an issue that you notice, you can go into the update settings and up at the top here, there's options to just pause updating or even uninstall the most recently installed update if there was a major issue. In addition to the default or the update rings, there's also feature update policies that let you control which feature update version you want devices to stay on. So if I deploy out a policy that says all devices can go to Windows 11 23H2, they'll do that. But then in the fall, when 24H2 comes out, none of my devices will go to that until I update this policy telling them that they're able to. So these are a great way to keep devices at whatever feature update level you want them to be at. And then finally, there's driver updates. So I mentioned drivers are able to go through Windows Update. You can create a policy here to either automatically or manually approve drivers, and you can create multiple policies targeted at multiple groups of devices. And then, yeah, you'll be able to have drivers either automatically install, or you can go in and approve drivers to install for devices. And I think that works great through the Windows Update node. You'll get them a little bit after you would normally get them using a vendor tool like a Dell Command Update or an HP Image Assistant. But then there's been a little bit of extra testing done on Microsoft's end. And Microsoft also has telemetry. So if they notice that there's an issue with a driver that's being deployed out, they'll pull that driver from deployment. So there's kind of some extra protections in place for you there. Okay, so that's kind of all the main pieces of the current Autopilot deployment. We set up all the profiles, we got the devices registered, we've got our apps, our configuration profiles, security settings, update settings, all built, and then we would target those all out at groups of devices or users, and then that all just gets picked up during the Autopilot deployment. And that's worked pretty well, though there's been, some user complaints about it, obviously. There kind of always is. So recently, Microsoft announced a newer version of Autopilot called Autopilot Device Preparation. Some people you'll see it referred to online as like Autopilot V2. It just is a kind of a different way of handling the Autopilot deployment. So this, if you want to test it out, it does work on only Windows 11, 22H2, and 23H2. And those devices need to have the March 2024 cumulative update or newer installed. If you go out on your volume licensing center and download like the Windows 10 or the Windows 11 media that says it includes the April patches, or that was like updated in April, that would include these updates, and then obviously any newer ones. So the main difference with this new device preparation is that, at least right now, devices are Entra joined only. It won't do hybrid join to like an old on-prem AD environment. They did kind of change around the UI and the end user experience to be more basic, I would say. There is better reporting though on the back end, and an easier ability for users to like collect log files. And then finally, there's no need to register devices with Autopilot. And in fact, you don't want to have devices registered with Autopilot for this. If you have a device that is registered in the Autopilot database, the traditional, V1 Autopilot will take precedence. So let's take a look at what that looks like in Intune. So if you go in your Intune tenant to enrollment or devices and enrollment, and you may or may not see this yet because Microsoft is still kind of actively rolling it out. It's very new. But there's this Windows Autopilot device preparation and then device preparation policies. So you can come in here and create a device preparation policy, give it a name, and then we have to target it at a device, or we have to select a device group. So the device group is the group where devices are going to be automatically put when they run through this preparation process. So I had made a group over here. Intune device prep default. So this is kind of the container where all the devices get dumped into as they run through this process. And the one thing to note about this group is it should be just an assigned group because it'll get auto-populated by Microsoft. And then on the owners tab, you need to make sure you set the Intune provisioning client as an owner. And that's something that should just by default show up in the list of your device types here. So Intune provisioning client. So once you've got that group created, we can specify it here. And then next we have configuration settings. So deployment mode, single user is the only option right now. There's no shared mode yet. User driven, also the only option. Azure AD joined or Entra ID joined, once again, the only option. And then the user should be a standard user or an administrator. So generally you want standard user. Out-of-box experience settings. So again, we can specify the timeout. So 30 minutes is the default. You could bump that up if you have a longer deployment or reduce it if you have a shorter one. You can customize the error message if there is an error that occurs during deployment. So if you want to put in your help desk phone number or URL or something. Allow the users to skip setup after multiple attempts. So if the autopilot deployment just keeps failing for some reason, give the user the option after they've tried a couple of times to just skip the deployment and get them into the desktop. And then you could, fix whatever the issue is afterwards. So at least the user, maybe if they're remote with a device, isn't stuck with a non-working device that they then have to ship back. And then also show the link to the diagnostics so that we could have the user easily be able to see those diagnostics, and maybe over the phone we could help them, troubleshoot what an issue is. Apps. So we can select apps here. So this isn't actually deploying the apps. What we would need to do is target all of the apps and settings and everything at this Intune device group that we built. So maybe we target 10 apps at this group. Then in here, what we can say is which of those apps do we want the autopilot process to wait to install before we let the user into the machine. So maybe I want the company portal and Microsoft Office to be on the machine. So it'll wait and do just those two, and then it'll let the user into the desktop, and all the other apps that I have targeted at the group will continue to install in the background. And I can do the same thing for scripts here. So maybe I have a couple of scripts. I want the configure default Windows settings and remove pre-installed vendor software scripts to run. Then I go next. You can optionally select scope tags if you're doing role-based administration here. And then assignments. So this is different from normal autopilot in that when we're assigning this policy, we're assigning it to a group of users, not devices. So I can select autopilot device prep users. So then what'll happen is when the device boots up and goes through the out-of-box experience, it gets to the sign-on screen and I sign in with my work credentials. It sees, oh, hey, this device or this user has a device prep policy assigned to it. So immediately take that device object and put it in the device group that I specified, and then start running it through autopilot and assign all the apps and policies and everything that's targeted at that group. Go next and save. And you can have multiple preparation policies here, and you see they have a priority on them. So if you have multiple policies assigned to like the same user, whichever one has the highest priority is the one that'll win out. So I do have a quick demo here of kind of what this looks like. And keep in mind, this is kind of early stages still. Things could change, but kind of what it looks like right now would be this. And this is, again, like a fresh device booting up to the out-of-box experience for the first time. So we click the language, keyboard layout, and then it goes through and comes up to the sign in with your user screen. So I'm going to sign in with my work credentials here. And then on the back end, it detects that this device needs to go through the autopilot device prep process. And once again, I did not register this device in the autopilot database. If I did, it would go through the old autopilot process. So importantly, if you want to use this new process, don't register the devices with autopilot. So this is kind of what the new UI looks like. There's just a percentage counter that goes up, and it just says, installing required apps and policies for your organization. It's pretty basic. We can see it'll go through here. It actually gets to like 28% completed and then just jumps to 100%. So as ever, it's not the most accurate progress bar in the whole world. And then we get required setup is complete. The user is able to click next and get into their desktop to start doing things. And any other software that I didn't say specifically wait to install on will now keep installing at the desktop while the user is using their machine. And there we go, desktop. So then the other thing I wanted to note just about this, or the last thing about device preparation policies, is that example I just did there. The device would initially be classified as a personal device because I just went through the standard user sign-in. There is a way to have the devices be marked as corporate-owned devices right away, and that's in Intune here under enrollment. There's corporate device identifiers, which these were previously just used for like more mobile devices. But if we go to upload CSV file, I don't actually have the option in my tenant yet. It hasn't been lit up, but there'll be a third option in here for specifying Windows device identifiers. So we could collect the serial number, manufacturer, and model off our devices, just like we did with the old autopilot process. But instead of registering them in the autopilot device list, we would actually upload them here in the corporate identifiers list so that those devices would be seen as corporate devices straight away. So that's kind of a quick look at the new autopilot device preparation. So that's going to be where I think Microsoft is looking to take autopilot in the future.
One question came through.
Yeah.
So it's a two-part question. It says, can the configuration manager install and run a TS during autopilot V2? And how can group tags be assigned to these devices going through autopilot V2?
So I don't know on the task sequence during autopilot V2. I'd imagine it's something that can still be done because it is still running as like system during the out-of-box experience. But I haven't actually played around with it enough to know for sure if the task sequence works yet. And as for the group tags, I don't think you can use the group tags because if you have the devices in that list, well, you might be able to have them in the autopilot list just with no autopilot deployment profile assigned. But if you have the device registered in the autopilot database, and there's an autopilot deployment profile assigned, that will then take precedence and the device won't do the device prep. So yeah, that's kind of the main topics that I wanted to cover today. So I'd say that's the end of my prepared presentation. So if anyone has any questions, we've got 5-10 minutes here to chat before the scheduled end of the presentation.
Okay, one came through. If we
Sure.
are currently using BitLocker and Lapse, how can you have Intune start handling those without causing issues?
Sure. So first for Lapse, I guess it depends if you're using the old version of Lapse. So I believe Microsoft Lapse is the old version and Windows Lapse is the new version. What I've seen most people do with that is just kind of like a cutover. So usually you would have like a group policy applying the old Microsoft Lapse settings. And then in Intune, you could create a new um, Windows Lapse policy under account protection here. And then if you had all the same devices in both locations, so say you have your devices co-managed, where they're in Intune, but they're also still getting group policy, you could just stop applying the group policy and start applying the lapse policy from Intune here. Um, and if you have the devices more in like a mixed mode where your on-prem devices are group policy, you can just keep them with the on-prem lapse and then have your cloud devices just pick up the new Windows lapse policy directly from Intune. And do the same kind of thing with BitLocker. So if you right now you have just again group policy telling devices to turn on BitLocker and store their recovery keys in Active Directory. Um, you could do the same thing here where you create a BitLocker policy in Intune and then target it at the devices and just again do that same type of cutover. Start applying the Intune policy and stop applying the group policy. Any other questions that you're seeing there, Jordan?
Don't see any right now. I also did just unlock the microphone if anyone wants to chime in, but feel free to keep using the chat. Maybe we'll give it another second.
And as I mentioned too, if anyone has questions that don't get answered here, you can just reach out to us at Now Micro and we'd be happy to chat via email or even jump on a short call to discuss. Or if you're interested in getting like a copy of like any of the scripts or anything that I showed during the presentation, again, reach out and we'd be happy to discuss.
Hey, John,
Yeah,
I
looks
had a
like
question here. Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead.
nope, you
I,
go.
I work with Benton County, and we're not a huge group, but we're looking at better ways to kind of upgrade our imaging process. We've looked at autopilot in the past, and it seems to be it's more focused or better suited for setting policy, apps, drivers for a remote worker situation, where I can, from HP or from Now Micro, send them that device, they log in, everything's set up. But none of our workers do that. They're coming on site to get these devices. Is autopilot necessarily an upgrade to this rather than us, manually just imaging a device and sending it to them?
I mean, it definitely depends, right?
Right.
So it can be an upgrade still if you're looking to just transition to the cloud more and you want to try to get away from that on-prem infrastructure. You
We're
can
currently hybrid.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you can effectively use autopilot to do that. And you can, mitigate some of the concerns with it. So like if you're concerned about doing a bunch of autopilot deployments on-prem at the same location and like internet bandwidth, you can spin up like a delivery optimization cache server to kind of help with that.
Okay.
But yeah, usually the main benefit would be you want to get away from trying to like maintain apps and settings and everything in Intune and configuration manager and group policy, all at the same time. You want to just kind of centralize everything to Intune, right? You're then working with more like that single pane of glass.
Yep.
And then you also don't have to worry about managing like the images and all of the drivers, right? If you're using the OS that comes pre-installed on the machine, because it's already going to be up to date and it's already going to have all the drivers. So it kind of saves you some effort in that regard as well.
Yep.
But yeah, I do see a lot of clients where if they already have a very mature configuration manager process built up, and especially if they're still doing hybrid deployments where they're joining to like local, on-prem Active Directory, a lot of times it still makes sense just to keep using that. And then as you push more into the cloud and start looking at those native cloud devices, I think Autopilot starts to make a lot more sense.
Okay, that confirms exactly what I was thinking. So I would like to play with Autopilot more and the shiny new thing, but it's just I don't know if it's a good fit for us yet. So thank you. Absolutely answered my question.
Okay. And I will say, yeah, there's a lot of times there's certain devices that make the most sense to go there right away, especially if you've got like, kiosk or shared use devices, maybe devices that are on like a public network that, doesn't normally talk to Active Directory. Those can be,
Right.
great kind of first steps into Intune and Autopilot.
Good to know.
A couple more came through in the
Yeah.
chat that'll bring us to the end here. So the first one says, did you mention that you are not able to use Autopilot with a hybrid environment?
You are able to use the current Autopilot with a hybrid deployment. So devices, enrollment, deployment profiles. If I create a profile here, for a user-driven Autopilot profile, I can have it do a hybrid join where it'll join to Entra and Active Directory. But the newer version of Autopilot, the device prep one, is Entra only. You can't do a hybrid with the newer model.
Second question says, what is the best way to find install and uninstall command while trying to deploy apps? Having a hard time sometimes to find the GUID.
Yeah, so usually the best way I would say is to go into the registry, actually. So if you go on a device like this one here, so local machine, software, Microsoft, Windows, current version, uninstall. Has all of the product GUIDs that are installed on your machine. And then there's also a 32-bit location, which is the same path, but it's software and then WoW64 32 node. So I'll generally look at one of those two locations. And then you can even do something where if you want to detect out of those locations, I'll commonly use a detection method script like this one, where I just dynamically search through both of those registry locations for a piece of software matching a display name. So then I don't have to worry about the specific GUID. I can just look for the display name and check the version. So yeah, definitely the registry, and then kind of combined with PowerShell, you get pretty good results.
All right, last question here. What if you use deep freeze on some machines? Will there be conflicts using this with Intune?
Yeah, I mean, deep freeze generally causes problems with all the management softwares. So a configuration manager, Intune, whatever, since as I understand it, deep freeze basically just every time you reboot the machine, reverts it back to a snapshot in time. So yeah, I would say deep freeze is probably not going to work well with Intune and Autopilot. But I don't have any personal experience trying to use it, so.
Okay, well, that's it for our questions and presentations. Again, if there's other things that come up as the day goes on, feel free to reach out to us. We will follow up with the recording from today's presentation. And then there was a question in the chat that said, will this be on YouTube? So I'll include the link to the Now Micro YouTube page as well. We'll upload it there. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jon.
Yep, thanks, everyone.